In the United States alone, more than 200,000 homicides have gone unsolved since 1980. Globally, the number of persons missing without explanation runs into the millions. Most of these cases are not famous. Most never receive sustained public attention. Most of the files sit, year after year, in police department cold case storage. What follows is a guided descent through the catalog of the unresolved. The cases at the surface you have likely heard of. The cases at the bottom you almost certainly have not. What they share is the absence of an answer. Tier 1, the famous files. Cases that have entered popular culture and remain familiar to general audiences. Jack the Ripper. Between August and November 1888, at least 5 women in the Whitechapel district of London were murdered with a consistent and distinctive pattern. The killer was never identified. The case generated a massive contemporary investigation by the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police over the following century. More than 100 named suspects have been proposed, ranging from local laborers to Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria. Modern reviews of the original Whitechapel files, conducted using forensic techniques unavailable in the 1,880 seconds, have produced new suspect identifications, but no conclusive resolution. The Ripper case is the foundational unsolved file of the modern era. It set the template for almost every cold case investigation that followed. The Zodiac Killer. Between December 1968 and October 1969, an unidentified person in the San Francisco Bay Area committed at least 5 murders, sent taunting letters and cryptograms to local newspapers, and threatened additional violence. The killer signed the letters Zodiac. The investigation by the San Francisco Police Department, the Vallejo Police Department, and the Napa County Sheriff's Office continued for decades. In 2018, the case was officially considered active but cold. Several major suspects, Arthur Leigh Allen, Gary Francis Post, and others, have been publicly named, none with conclusive forensic confirmation. 3 of the 4 Zodiac ciphers were eventually decoded. The 4th, known as Z32, has not been definitively solved. The Z340 cipher, unbroken for 51 years, was decoded in 2020 by a private team of codebreakers from Belgium, Australia, and the United States. The Z32 cipher remains uncracked. The Zodiac's identity remains unconfirmed. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart. On the 2nd of July 1937, the aviator Amelia Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan disappeared over the Central Pacific during an attempted around. The World flight, the last confirmed radio contact, placed them near Howland Island. Despite an immediate search by the United States Navy involving multiple ships and aircraft, neither Earhart nor Noonan nor the Lockheed Electra were recovered. Subsequent decades have produced multiple theories. The crash and sank hypothesis, supported by the navigation data, places the aircraft on the deep seafloor near Howland. The Nikomoro hypothesis, supported by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, proposes that Earhart and Noonan reached the island of Nikomoro and survived for some period before perishing. The Japanese capture hypothesis, less well supported, proposes that they were detained in the Marshall Islands. Recent deep-sea searches have produced sonar contacts of interest. No verified aircraft wreckage has been recovered. The Mary Celeste. On the 5th of December 1872, the American brigantine Mary Celeste was found drifting under partial sail in the Atlantic, 600 miles west of Portugal. The ship was seaworthy. The cargo, 1,500 barrels of denatured alcohol, was intact. The lifeboat was missing, the captain, his wife, there too. Year, old daughter, and 7 crew members were gone. The lifeboat and its occupants were never found. Investigations at the time considered piracy, mutiny, and insurance fraud. Modern analyses have proposed multiple causes. An alcohol vapor explosion that prompted an evacuation. A seaquake or rogue wave that suggested the ship was sinking, when in fact it was not, or some combination. No theory accounts for every observed feature of the abandoned ship. The Mary Celeste was returned to commercial service. The case became the archetype of the unmanned ghost ship. The fate of its occupants has not been determined in over a century and a half. The Black Dahlia. On the 15th of January 1947, the body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short was found in a vacant lot in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The killing was extraordinarily violent, deliberately staged, and accompanied by detailed press. Targeted communication from the apparent killer. The Los Angeles Police Department conducted what was at the time the largest murder investigation in the city's history. More than 150 named suspects were interviewed, multiple confessions were received, all evaluated and discounted. Several suspects, including a doctor named George Hodel, remained persons of interest for decades. Hodel was named publicly by his own son, a retired LAPD detective. In a 2003 book, the identity of the killer has not been confirmed by forensic standards. The case file at LAPD remains officially open. At Tier 1, the famous files have penetrated public consciousness for decades or centuries. Their familiarity is itself part of their hold. Tier 2, the documented but unfamiliar. Major cases that received contemporary investigation but never broke through into wide public awareness. The Hinterkaifeck murders. In late March 1922, 6 members of the Gruber family were killed with a mattock at their isolated farmhouse in rural Bavaria. The family had reported strange footprints in the snow leading to the farm but not away from it. They had reported hearing footsteps in the attic. Days later, neighbors found the bodies in the barn and the house. The Bavarian investigation interviewed more than 100 suspects. The killer or killers had apparently remained at the farm for days after the killings, feeding the livestock and lighting fires. The motive was never determined. The identity of the perpetrator was never established. The case was reopened multiple times across the 20th century, most recently in 2007 by the Bavarian Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck. The 2007 reinvestigation produced a leading suspect whose name was withheld out of respect to surviving relatives. No prosecution followed. The case file remains active in name. In practice, it is one of the oldest unsolved mass murders in modern European history. The Dialov Pass Incident. In February 1959, 9 experienced ski hikers led by Igor Dyatlov died in the northern Ural Mountains under highly unusual circumstances. The hikers cut their way out of their tent from the inside, fled into the cold partially undressed, and died at varying distances from camp from a combination of hypothermia and traumatic injuries. Several bodies showed internal injuries consistent with significant force without external wounds. One showed traces of elevated radioactivity. The Soviet investigation in 1959 concluded that an unknown compelling force was responsible. The case file was sealed for decades. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation. In 2021, a study published in Communications, Earth and Environment proposed that a slab avalanche, modeled with updated snow mechanics calculations, could account for both the flight from the tent and the unusual injuries. The avalanche model has not been accepted by all researchers. Alternative theories continue to circulate, including military weapons, testing infrasound, induced panic, and katabatic wind events. The case is officially closed under the avalanche conclusion. The lingering details continue to be examined. The Tamam Shud case. On the 1st of December 1948, the body of an unidentified man was found on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia. The man wore a suit. He had no identification. The labels had been removed from his clothing, in the fob pocket of his trousers. Investigators found a tightly rolled scrap of paper with the printed words Tamam Shud, Persian for ended or finished, torn from the final page of a specific edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The matching book was located months later. Inside the back cover were faint pencil marks resembling a code. Adjacent to the code was a local phone number. The number belonged to a nurse who denied knowing the dead man. The man's identity was not established at the time. The cause of death was never definitively determined. The code has not been decoded. In 2022, researchers at the University of Adelaide announced that DNA recovered from a hair sample matched a man named Carl Charles Webb, a Melbourne-born electrical engineer. The identification has not been universally accepted, and the question of how and why he died on the beach with a coded note in his pocket remains open. The Sodder children disappearance. On Christmas Eve 1945, the home of George and Jenny Sodder in Fayetteville, West Virginia, caught fire. The parents and 4 of their children escaped. 5 children ages 5 to 14 did not. The bodies of the 5 missing children were not found in the burned remains. The Sodders, over decades, accumulated evidence that the children may have been abducted before the fire and that the fire was set deliberately. Reported sightings of children resembling the missing came in from across the country. A photograph was mailed to the family in 1968 of a man who the Sodders believed resembled what their son Louis would have looked like as an adult. The photograph was anonymous. The investigation by West Virginia authorities was inconclusive. A billboard erected by the Sodders along Route 16 remained in place until Jenny Sodder's death in 1989. The children were never definitively located. The fire was never definitively attributed to either accident or arson. The case is unresolved. The Lead Masks case. On the 20th of August 1966, the bodies of 2 electronics technicians, Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, were found on Vintum Hill near Niterói, Brazil. Both wore formal suits. Both wore homemade lead masks resembling welding eye shields. Neither showed external signs of injury. Beside the bodies was a notebook containing a list of instructions ending with the words 1630, be at the determined place 1830 swallow capsules. After effect protect metals, wait for mask signal. The Brazilian autopsies were inconclusive, toxicology equipment available in 1966 was limited. The bodies had been exposed for several days. The cause of death was never determined. The reason for the lead masks was never determined. The mask signal was never identified. Subsequent theories have proposed UFO contact attempts, occult experimentation, criminal activity involving toxic substances, or some combination. The original autopsy materials were never re-examined with later forensic methods. The case file in Niterói remains open as a matter of administrative record. At Tier 2, the documented cases have full police files, named victims, and contemporary investigation. The answers, despite all that, are still missing. Tier 3, the Vanishings, cases where individuals or groups disappeared without trace, often without recovered remains. The Roanoke Colony. In 1587, an English expedition founded a settlement on Roanoke Island in modern North Carolina. The settlement included 115 people, including the first English child born in the Americas. When the colony's governor John White returned from a supply trip to England in 1590, the settlement was abandoned, houses had been dismantled. Personal possessions were missing. The only deliberate communication was a word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island and of an associated indigenous group. White interpreted the carving as a signal that the colonists had relocated to that island. A storm prevented his investigation. He returned to England. He was never able to mount another expedition. The fate of the Roanoke colonists has been a subject of investigation for 4 centuries. Modern archaeological work has identified possible associated material on Hatteras Island, including European artifacts in indigenous habitation layers. The accumulating evidence supports an absorption hypothesis. The colonists were taken in by the Croatoan people and their descendants intermingled with the local population. The conclusive identification has not yet been made. The colony as a discrete settlement disappeared. The alien, more lighthouse keepers. In December 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers at the Flannan Isles, lighthouse off the coast of Scotland, disappeared from their post. A relief vessel arrived 2 weeks later to find the lamps unlit, the doors locked, and the keepers missing. The lighthouse logbook contained entries describing a severe storm. The final entry on the 15th of December was unremarkable. 2 sets of oilskins were missing from the keepers' quarters, 1 set remained. The west side landing had been damaged by what investigators concluded was a freak wave. The proposed explanation: 2 keepers went to secure equipment at the west landing during the storm. A wave swept them off the cliff. The 3rd keeper, seeing his colleagues swept away, attempted a rescue and was also lost. The disappearance was investigated by the Northern Lighthouse Board. The proposed explanation accounts for many of the observed details but has gaps. The bodies were never recovered. The full sequence of events on the rocks of Ilion Moor in December 1900 is not known. The disappearance of Frederick Valenchik. On the 21st of October 1978, 20-year-old pilot Frederick Valenchik was flying a Cessna 182L over Bay Strait between mainland Australia and Tasmania. In his final transmission to Melbourne Air Traffic Control, Valenchik described an unidentified aircraft flying above him, then orbiting at high speed, then accompanying him. He reported that his engine was rough idling. His final transmission contained a metallic scraping sound and ended. The Cessna and Valenchik were never recovered. The Royal Australian Air Force and the Department of Transport conducted searches. No wreckage was found. The transcript of Valenchik's transmissions was studied by aviation investigators and ufologists. Conventional explanations have included pilot disorientation, fuel tank issues, and intentional disappearance. The unidentified aircraft has never been correlated with any known traffic in the area. In 1983, a part identified as consistent with a Cessna Valenchik's type was washed up on Flinders Island. The part could not be definitively linked to a specific aircraft. The investigation remains open in Australian aviation records. The Bermea Phantom Island. On Spanish, Mexican, and American maps from the 16th through the early 20th century, an island named Bermea was depicted in the Gulf of Mexico off the Yucatan Peninsula. The island, described as reddish in color, appeared with reasonable consistency for over 400 years. In 1997, and again in 2009, expeditions by the Mexican Navy attempted to locate the island. They found no land at the documented coordinates and no submerged feature, consistent with a recently sunken island. The disappearance of Bermea, if it ever existed, has consequences for Mexican maritime boundaries with the United States in the Gulf. Bermea, if real, would have extended Mexican exclusive economic zone over significant oil, Bering seabed. Multiple Mexican investigators have proposed that the island was deliberately removed from existence, possibly through explosives during the Cold War. To favor American maritime claims, the proposal is contested. Alternative explanations include cartographer error replicated through the centuries, a small low-lying island eroded by sea level rise and storms, or the conflation of nearby reefs with a charted feature. The island appeared on maps. It is not currently visible. The reason for its absence has not been determined. The crew of the Carroll Ad Earring. In January 1921, the 5-masted commercial schooner Carroll Ad Earring was found grounded on Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The ship was largely intact. The galley showed evidence of an interrupted meal. The crew of 11, the captain and his son, were missing. The lifeboats were missing. Personal possessions had been disturbed. An investigation by the United States Departments of Treasury, Commerce, State Justice, and Navy was conducted. Several theories were considered: mutiny, piracy by rum running interest during Prohibition, and capture by Soviet vessels in connection with us. Soviet tensions of the era. A second American ship, the Hewitt, disappeared in the same approximate region during the same week. No definitive theory was confirmed. The crew of the Carroll Ad Earring was never located. The disappearance of the Hewitt was never explained. The case file at the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, remained active for decades. The events off Cape Hatteras in January 1921 remain among the most thoroughly documented and least resolved maritime disappearances in American history. At Tier 3, the Vanishings leave no remains and no explanation. The accumulated absence is the case. Tier 4, the Cold Files, investigated cases that received attention at the time but have lingered without resolution for decades. The Cleveland Torso Murderer. Between 1935 and 1938, an unidentified person in Cleveland, Ohio, killed and dismembered at least 12 people. The victims were primarily homeless or marginally housed men and women in the Kingsbury Run area near the city's flats. The killings were extraordinarily violent. Bodies were typically decapitated, with most never identified by name. The investigation was led by Elliot Ness, who had recently arrived in Cleveland as the city's director of public safety after his organized crime in Chicago. Ness's investigation focused on a suspect named Frank DeLiesel, who died in jail under disputed circumstances in 1939. And a second suspect, Dr. Francis Sweeney, whom Ness believed responsible but could not prosecute. Sweeney committed himself to a series of mental institutions and lived until 1964. The killing stopped in 1938. The case file at the Cleveland Police Department remains open. The identity of the Cleveland Torso Murderer has not been confirmed by modern forensic standards. The boy in the box. In February 1957, the body of a small boy was found in a cardboard box on Susquehanna Road in Philadelphia. The boy, estimated to be 4 to 6 years old, was malnourished. He had been beaten. He was not identified for 65 years. The Philadelphia Police Department conducted a massive search, distributing tens of thousands of flyers and pursuing every reported sighting. No family came forward. The case became known as America's Unknown Child. In December 2022, the Philadelphia Police Department announced that the boy had been identified through investigative genetic genealogy as Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born the 13th of January 1953. The identification, after decades of work by amateur and professional investigators, was based on DNA matched to relatives. The identification of the perpetrator has not been made public. The investigation is active. The identity question after 65 years has been answered. The question of who killed Joseph Zarelli and why his disappearance was never reported is, as of this script's composition, still being pursued. The case demonstrates the impact of modern genetic genealogy techniques on historic cold cases. The murder of the Grimes sisters. In December 1956, sisters Barbara and Patricia Grimes, ages 15 and 13, disappeared after attending a movie theater showing of Love Me Tender in Chicago. Their bodies were found 1 month later along German Church Road in Willow Springs, Illinois. They had been left in a manner suggesting deliberate placement. The cause of death was determined to be exposure. The Chicago Police Department conducted what was, at the time, the largest investigation in city history. A confession from a man named Edward Bedwell was retracted under questioning. Multiple subsequent suspects were investigated. No prosecution succeeded. The case file accumulated thousands of pages over the following decades. Theories have proposed organized crime involvement, an unknown serial offender, or a connection to a series of related Chicago area unsolved cases of the 1950 seconds. The case remains open at the Cook County Sheriff's Office. The killer of the Grimes sisters has not been identified by modern forensic standards. The servant girl annihilator. Between December 1884 and December 1885, an unidentified killer in Austin, Texas, killed at least 7 women and 1 man, primarily targeting domestic workers. The killings were violent, often involving intrusion into the victim's sleeping quarters. The contemporary press In language consistent with the era, called the killer, the servant girl annihilator, a term coined by author O. Henry, then a resident of Austin. The Austin investigation produced multiple arrests and no conviction. The killing stopped in late December 1885. Some 20th century writers have proposed that the same offender may have been responsible for the Whitechapel killings in London 3 years later. The proposal is unsupported by direct evidence and is generally not accepted by mainstream researchers. The Austin case predates Jack the Ripper by 3 years. It is, by some measures, the first documented sequential murderer in American history. The identity of the killer has not been determined. The Long Island serial killer. Since 1996, the bodies and remains of at least 11 people, most of them women working in sex trade settings, have been recovered along the South Shore of Long Island, New York. The pattern of victim selection and disposal indicated the work of one or more serial offenders. The case became publicly known in 2010 after the search for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert led to the discovery of multiple sets of remains in the Gilgo Beach area. For more than a decade, the investigation by the Suffolk County Police Department produced no charges. In July 2023, a Suffolk County architect named Rex Huerman was arrested and charged in connection with several of the killings. The arrest followed a renewed investigation that included cellular metadata, vehicle records, and forensic hair analysis. Additional charges have been filed in subsequent months. The investigation is ongoing. At the time of this script's composition, some of the Long Island remains have not been linked to the named defendant. Whether all of the killings are attributable to a single offender or to multiple offenders has not been publicly established. The case demonstrates that even when a major suspect is in custody, the full scope of a serial pattern may take years more to confirm. At Tier 4, the cold files have decades of accumulated investigation. Modern techniques are reopening some of them. Most are not yet closed. Tier 5, the obscure. Cases that lie outside the standard catalog of widely discussed unsolved files, surviving primarily in regional records and specialist literature. The Villisca Axe murders. On the night of the 9th of June, -10/1912, 8 people, the Moore family of 6 and 2 visiting children, were killed with an axe in their home in Villisca, Iowa. The killings were performed in their beds at night. The killer covered each victim's face, set up specific objects in the house, and washed in a basin of water before leaving. The Villisca investigation, complicated by destruction of evidence at the scene by curious neighbors, identified multiple suspects across the following decades. A traveling preacher named George Kelly was tried twice, the first trial resulting in a hung jury, the second in acquittal. A businessman named Frank F. Jones was suspected, never charged. The killings occurred during the same year as a series of similar axe murders in towns across the central United States. The connection between the cases has been investigated and remains a matter of scholarly dispute. The Villisca house is preserved as a museum. The case file at the Iowa Department of Public Safety is open. The killer has not been identified. The Bear Brook murders. In November 1985, a 55-gallon steel drum containing the remains of a woman and a child was found in Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. In May 2015, years later, a second drum containing the remains of 2 additional children was found within 100 yards of the first. The 4 victims had been killed at different times, but all had been left at the same location, in containers consistent with deliberate concealment. The victims went unidentified for 32 years. In 2017, investigative genetic genealogy work led by Barbara Ray, Venter identified the woman as Marlise Honeychurch and 3 of the children as her daughters and the daughter of a relative. The killer was identified as Terrence Peter Rasmussen, a man who had used multiple aliases throughout his life and had died in prison in California in 2010 under one of those aliases. Rasmussen had killed Marlise Honeychurch and at least one of his own former partners. One of the children in the Bear Brook drums has not been identified. The girl known only as the middle child is genetically a daughter of Rasmussen. Her mother has not been identified. The girl's full identity has not been established. The case demonstrates how a multi-decade unidentified remains file can be partially solved, while crucial questions remain. The Phantom Killer of Texarkana. Between February and May 1946, an unidentified person in Texarkana attacked 8 people in Lover's Lane settings, killing 5 of them. The attacker wore a white hood. The killings stopped without resolution. The case became known regionally as the Moonlight Murders. A primary suspect, Ewell Swinney, was identified through investigation by Texas Ranger Manuel, Lone Wolf Gonzalez, and his colleagues. Swinney was never charged in the Moonlight Murders. He was convicted of an unrelated offense and spent decades in prison. He was released. He died in 1994. The case file at the Texas Department of Public Safety is open. The Phantom Killer was the subject of a 1976 film. the town that dreaded sundown, which itself was followed by an apparent copycat killing in 1946, a chronological impossibility now mostly attributed to confused press reports of the time. The legend remains active in the region. The identity of the original killer has not been confirmed. The Wattenfield disappearances. In remote areas of the American Intermountain West and in the Adirondacks of New York, missing person investigators have documented a recurring pattern of disappearances of children and elderly hikers under conditions that resist conventional explanation. The bodies, when recovered, have sometimes been found at locations inconsistent with the apparent direction of travel. Footwear has been found neatly placed, clothing has been removed. The phenomenon has been compiled in extensive serial documentation by retired police detective David Paulies, who has cataloged thousands of cases worldwide under the term Missing 411. Mainstream search and rescue professionals attribute the cases to a combination of standard exposure mechanisms: hypothermia, induced paradoxical undressing, disorientation, terrain features that obscure tracking, and the natural distribution of remains by scavenging. Paulies and others propose that the patterns are not fully explained by these mechanisms and merit additional investigation. The dispute between these interpretations is active. What is not in dispute? The cases are real. The disappearances and deaths occurred. The interpretations of what happened in each case remain open. The Bricca family murders. In September 1966, Jerry, Linda, and Debbie Bricca were killed in their home in Bridgetown, Ohio. The family had been killed in the bedrooms of the house. The crime scene showed signs of deliberate concealment. The Hamilton County investigation produced a primary suspect, an associate of Jerry Bricca named Alfred Pugh, but never developed sufficient evidence to charge. The Bricca case was reopened multiple times across the following decades. DNA testing of original evidence in the 2010 seconds produced results that, by reports, did not match the principal historical suspect. The case file at the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office remains open. The Bricca killings occurred in the same approximate period as several other prominent unsolved family killings in the American Midwest. The connection, if any, between these cases has been investigated and not confirmed. The killer of the Bricca family has not been identified. At Tier 5, the obscure cases are documented, but rarely discussed. They sit in regional archives, in police department drawers, in the long memories of small communities. Tier 6, the buried. Cases that are exceptionally obscure, not because they are unimportant, but because circumstances have kept them outside both public and investigative attention. The unidentified victims of the Highway of Tears. Along Highway 16 in northern British Columbia between Prince George and Prince Rupert, at least 18 women, most of them indigenous, have disappeared or been killed since 1969. The actual number, by reports from local communities and indigenous-led inquiries, is likely much higher. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigation, formerly called Project EPANA, has cataloged fewer than half of the cases that the affected communities consider connected. Several of the killings have been attributed to identified offenders, including American serial offender Bobby Jack Fowler, who died in prison in 2006, and is forensically linked to at least one of the Highway 16 cases. Most of the cases have not been attributed. The pattern of disappearances along the highway has continued into the current decade. Multiple inquiries, including the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada, have addressed systemic failures in investigation. The historical record on the Highway of Tears is incomplete. The number of victims is likely greater than the catalog. The pattern is ongoing. The smiley face killings hypothesis. Across the United States since the late 1990 seconds, retired NYPD detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte have proposed that approximately 50 deaths of young men by drowning, typically college age, typically with high blood alcohol levels, show patterns suggesting deliberate killing rather than accidental drowning. The proposed signature involves a smiley face graffiti, symbol found at or near a number of the recovery sites. The hypothesis is contested. Major city medical examiners and the FBI have stated that the catalog of cases is explainable by the high statistical rate of alcohol-related drowning deaths among young men, and that the graffiti correlations may be coincidental given the prevalence of the smiley face symbol in American public spaces. The families of some of the victims have publicly supported the hypothesis. The institutional response has been skeptical. What is established? The deaths occurred. The men were real. The investigations were performed by local authorities. Whether they share a common cause beyond the demographic and behavioral baseline is, in the current state of investigation, unsettled. The Oakville Blob Incident. On the 7th of August 1994, residents of Oakville, Washington, reported a small particulate substance falling from the sky during a heavy rain. The substance, described as gelatinous and approximately the size of grains of rice, fell across an area of approximately 20 square miles. Multiple residents reported respiratory illness following exposure. One resident's pet died. The samples were analyzed by the Washington State Department of Health. Reports indicated the presence of human white blood cells and at least 2 species of bacteria. The source of the substance was never determined. Some hypotheses proposed a military source, specifically debris from a bombing run conducted over the Pacific that day involving live ordnance and pelagic life. Other hypotheses proposed agricultural drift, industrial accident, or a natural phenomenon related to jellyfish-rich storm cells. The Washington State investigation closed without conclusion. Several residents pursued legal action, none successfully. The Oakville blob incident is one of multiple unexplained falls of unidentified substances documented across the 20th century. The cause has not been determined. The Belmez faces. In August 1971, in the village of Belmez de la Moraleda in southern Spain, a resident named Maria Gomez Camara reported that an image of a face had appeared on her concrete kitchen floor. The face, sometimes referred to as the pavo, was photographed by Spanish researchers. Over subsequent decades, additional faces appeared on the same floor in different positions. The phenomenon was reported by the Belmez family for over 30 years. Multiple investigations were conducted. Some Spanish parapsychologists treated the case as a serious anomalous phenomenon. Skeptical investigators concluded that the images had been deliberately produced using a combination of chemicals applied to the concrete and progressive reapplication. The Belmez family denied this. The faces continued to appear, including after Maria Gomez Camara's death in 2004. The Belmez faces have been the subject of multiple academic papers, both supporting and contesting their authenticity. The chemical application hypothesis has not been forensically demonstrated. The alternative hypotheses have not been forensically demonstrated. The faces' photographic record of which exists were not formally explained. The deaths at Yuba County. In February 1978, 5 men from Yuba County, California, all with developmental and cognitive disabilities, left a basketball game and disappeared. Their car was found abandoned in a remote area in the Plumas National Forest. The bodies of 4 of the men were recovered over the following months in the forest. The 5th, Gary Matthias, has not been found. Examination of the recovery sites and the conditions of the bodies indicated the men had walked many miles into deep snow, without provisions. One had taken shelter in a forestry trailer that contained adequate food, did not eat the food, and died there. The Yuba County case has not been explained. The disappearance from the car, the route into the wilderness, the survival behaviors of men who would not normally have undertaken such a journey, and the fate of Gary Matthias all remain open. The investigation by Plumas and Yuba County authorities closed without conclusion. The case file is open. The Yuba County disappearance is one of the most studied missing person cases in modern California history. It is among the cases featured in multiple compilations of unexplained mountain disappearances. The reason for the men's behavior on the night of the 24th of February 1978 has never been established. At Tier 6, the buried cases survive in tightly constrained documentation. Most readers will never encounter them. The institutions that should preserve them are imperfect. Tier 7, the bottom. Cases and patterns at the deepest edges of the catalog, those that resist both standard investigation and standard categorization. The Unidentified Decedents Catalog. In the United States, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NamUs, maintains a database of unidentified human remains in the custody of medical examiners and coroners. As of recent reporting, NamUs contains entries on more than 15,000 sets of unidentified remains. The actual total of unidentified remains in American custody is estimated to be substantially higher, with some estimates placing it above 40,000. Each entry represents a person who lived, died, and was recovered without being identified. Some are recent, some date to the 1950 seconds. Some are older. Identification is possible through DNA, dental records, fingerprints, isotopic analysis, and increasingly investigative genetic genealogy. The rate of identification has improved with the spread of these techniques. The backlog remains large. At the bottom of the iceberg, the bulk of the unsolved is not famous and is not narratively coherent. It is administrative. It is 15,000 or 40,000 sets of remains, each a person, each lacking a name, each waiting on technology, funding, or coincidence. The pattern of unidentified DOE cases. Among the unidentified remains, a substantial subset has been recovered along major American highways. Several federal-level analyses have noted the concentration of unidentified roadside remains along Interstate 5, Interstate 40, Interstate 70, and Interstate 75. The pattern has been associated with the broader question of how long haul truck drivers and other transient populations interact with victims of opportunistic violence. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative, launched by the FBI in 2009, maintains a database of more than 750 unsolved homicides and missing person cases along these corridors. Several offenders, including Robert Ben Rohades and others, have been identified and convicted in connection with subsets of the cases. The majority remain unattributed. The initiative's caseload increases each year. Identifications and attributions occur, but at a rate slower than new cases are added. The roadside decedent pattern is among the best documented and least resolved investigatory areas in American law enforcement. The North American trafficking disappearances. The full count of persons who disappear into trafficking networks in North America is by the nature of the activity not knowable in detail. National reporting requirements have improved since the early 2000s. The available figures from federal and state authorities indicate that in any given year, several 100,000 missing person reports are filed in the United States. The vast majority are resolved within a short period. A persistent residual, in the tens of thousands, remains unresolved beyond a year. Within the unresolved subset, a portion is associated with trafficking. The associated case data is incomplete, often dispersed across jurisdictions, and frequently not reconciled across borders. The total number of persons in this category cannot be specified. The trajectory of the individual cases cannot, in most instances, be reconstructed. At the bottom of the iceberg, the persons categorized as missing into trafficking are not files in a single archive. They are a distributed, partial, and ongoing pattern. The number is not known. The names are not known. The fates are not knowable from existing records. The deep, cold cases. In the United Kingdom, the murders of the Pendleton witch hunt of 1612 are technically not unsolved. They resulted in convictions and executions. But the question of what actually happened in Pendle Forest in 1612, separable from the witchcraft accusations and confessions, has been studied by historians for 4 centuries without consensus. In France, the murders attributed to the Beast of Abaddon, approximately 100 deaths between 1764 and 1767, have been variously attributed to wolves, hybrid canids, or human predators. These cases, centuries old, represent the practical floor of cold case investigation. The original documentation is fragmentary. The physical evidence is gone. The witnesses are gone. The forensic methods that might confirm or refute any modern hypothesis are not applicable. What we know about these deep historical killings, we know from contemporary accounts. The accounts are filtered through the political, religious, and superstitious frameworks of their eras. Modern history has revisited each of these cases multiple times. The questions of what actually happened, who was responsible, and what motivated the killings remain partially unanswered. They are now closer to historical questions than to investigative ones. The unrecoverable. At the bottom of the iceberg sits the category of cases that, by the nature of how they occurred and how time has passed, cannot be solved by any available technique. Maritime disappearances in deep water before modern position, reporting aviation disappearances in remote regions before transponder requirements. Wilderness disappearances in environments that consume remains rapidly. Battlefield disappearances in conflicts where individual identity was not preserved. These cases will not be closed. Modern forensic science extends backward only so far. DNA degrades. Documentation is lost. Physical evidence is removed by the same processes that produce the disappearance. The cases that we know about and have cataloged in this category are kept in the registries as a matter of formal completeness. The cases that we do not know about in this category exist in numbers that cannot be estimated. At the bottom of the unsolved mysteries iceberg, the deepest stratum is not a list of named files. It is the recognition that, for some events, the absence of an answer is the final state. The cases will sit, named or unnamed, in the registry of human disappearance until the registry itself is no longer maintained. At the surface, you have the famous files, the Ripper, the Zodiac, the Black Dahlia, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Beneath the surface, the documented but unfamiliar, the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, the Tamam Shud beach body, the lead masks on Vinton Hill. Beneath that, the Vanishings, the lost colony at Roanoke, the lighthouse at Ilion Moor. The pilot Valenchik over Bay Strait, beneath that the cold files, the Cleveland torsos, the boy in the box, the bodies on the south shore of Long Island, beneath that the obscure, the Iowa axe murders at Villisca, the steel drums in Bear Brook. The Texas phantom on the highways, beneath that the buried, the women along the highway of tears, the men in Yuba County, the patterns the institutions have not assembled. And at the bottom, the unrecoverable, the registry entries that will remain entries, the names that will remain unspoken, the answers that will not be reconstructed. More than 200,000 homicides in the United States since 1980 unresolved. Millions of persons missing worldwide. Most of the cases are not famous, most of the cases will not be solved. What they share is the absence of an answer, and the durability of that absence across years, and decades, and in some cases, centuries. The iceberg of the unsolved is not static. Each year, advances in forensic genealogy, in cellular metadata and isotopic analysis, in cooperative international databases, close some of the files. Each year, new files are opened. The work is not finished.